From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome everyone to the November meeting of the Washington Area Group for Print Culture Studies. This will be our last meeting in this calendar year, and we'll pick up again in February. And we will meet in February, March, and April in the spring. So we hope you'll try to join us for those if you're interested. We have a reflector list. If anybody is here who's not on the reflector list and you'd like to hear about our meetings, if you talk to myself or Eleanor, we can get you on the list, and we keep it deactivated so you don't get spammed through that if you'd like to be on that list. Anything else? There's been so much going on in the past couple of weeks. After the talk, we have to clear out of here pretty much at 5 o'clock on a Friday. And after the talk, we go for drinks and dinner with the speaker. And if you'd like an opportunity to continue conversations with the speaker, that's a very good opportunity to do that. And it's always a very congenial group that goes for that as well. So if you'd like to join us, we'd like to invite anyone who's interested to come along and join us. And so we're very pleased today to have Anthony Lee, who's been a member of this group, and he has a handout if you didn't get it. There's some copies by the door, who's been a member of our group. And he's going to talk to us about Johnson's dictionary and some well-known literary figures. And Eleanor will give Tony a more detailed introduction.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're very pleased to have Anthony Lee here today. His research centers on Samuel Johnson and his circle, mentoring and intertextuality. He has published 3 books and more than 30 essays on Johnson and 18th century literature and culture. He has 3 more books forthcoming, very busy. One is Community and Solitude, New Essays on Johnson's Circle with Bucknell Press, and that's coming out in 2018. Modernity Johnson, Samuel Johnson Among the Modernists, and that's coming out, Clemson University Press, 2019. In addition, he is currently serving a self-imposed life sentence editing the Annotated Rambler. Anthony has taught at a number of colleges and universities, including the University of Arkansas, Arkansas Tech, a university, Kentucky Wesleyan College, the University of the District of Columbia, and the University of Maryland University College, where he also served as Director of English and Humanities Programs. Today's talk draws upon 2 pieces scheduled for publication in 2018. One will appear in Notes and Queries, and the other in the Johnsonian News Letter. So, let's welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. And I'd like to thank Eleanor and Sabrina for, I'm not supposed to stray too far from this, Eleanor and Sabrina for offering me the opportunity to have a conversation with you about Samuel Johnson. And I'd also like to thank a former student of mine, Deb McCarson, and her husband John, who drove up here, or down here I should say, from New Jersey to be here. So I'm very grateful that they made the time to do that. I'm going to start with a brief description of an underlying premise of this paper, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodological terminology, and then I'm going to plunge into the narrative itself. So the underlying premise, my approach, also my talk is fairly detailed textually, so I'll have reference to the handout and also to the PowerPoint. So hopefully that'll help you navigate the details. My approach will be to look at small things, things typically considered marginal, both literally, mottos which occupy the margins of the page, and figuratively, unimportant by some people. It is my hope by the time that I'm done here that some of you perhaps will be persuaded to agree with Detective Somerset, who's quoted on the handout, one of my mottos, postulate that we should seek to find one item, one detail until it becomes an inexhaustible possibility. And that's a wonderful movie. It's a very grisly and gory movie, but it's a wonderful movie. And Somerset is like a literary critic. I mean, literally, he uses Dante and Chaucer to help uncover the criminal. But I think he provides a good model for us literary critics who look for clues and try to come up with hypotheses and find what ultimately may be the truth. So the methodological parameters, French theorist and critic Gerard Genet has developed the concept of transtextuality, which is his general inclusive term for the relationships between a text and other text. He has identified 5 transtextual regimes, 2 of which I will use here today. The first is on your handout, the intertextual, a relation of co-presence between 2 or more texts, most often by the literal presence of one text within the other. And these typically consist of quotations, allusions, plagiarism, among other things. And the second term that I want to use is paratextual, that is, the liminal devices and conventions both within and outside of the book that mediate it to the reader. And these would include titles, forewords, dedications, notes, epigraphs, epilogues, etc., among many other things. And for us today, the salient example is the motto, periodical essay motto. So we shall plunge into the narrative. Today I want to look primarily at 2 texts, 2 Johnsonian texts, the dictionary and the Rambler. The Rambler, as I'm sure many of you know, is a series of 208 periodical essays that Johnson composed between 1750 and 1752. They're considered by many people, perhaps me, to be his greatest work. Other contenders would be the Lives of the Poets, and for some people, Rassless, in terms of his literary production. But I go back and forth between them myself. But since I'm editing the Rambler, I have to stick with that one. And then, of course, the dictionary probably needs no introduction to a learned audience such as this. And Johnson was working on both of these simultaneously. The dictionary between 1747 and 55, and the Rambler, as I said, 50 to 52. So there is some interesting overlap and interpenetration between the 2. So we'll begin specifically by looking at Rambler number 2, which is on the necessity and danger of looking into futurity. Following The Spectator, Johnson used classical mottos to introduce his essays. In many respects, he may be seen as following in the footsteps of Addison and Steele, despite the significant differences separating their respective periodical projects. The motto in both served as a textual portal into the essay as an oblique précis. Given the close association of the motto with the epigram, proverb, maxim, etc., genres with strong moral connotations, the motto melded snugly with Johnson's overriding ethical emphasis. And the one that I've singled out to look at today is taken from the Latin Silver Age poet Statius, from his epic Thebaid. And the handout should have a prose translation. To stand still is torture, 1,000 paces are wasted before the start. The heavy hoof strikes the absent flat. Both the Spectator and the Rambler were aimed primarily at a literate middle-class audience. Many of the readers would have known Latin, but many would not, and even less would have known Greek. And so the classical models may have been adopted to lend an aura of intellectual prestige to the essays that followed. Nonetheless, many of the readers would require translation. Lists were soon provided with English translations. And for Johnson in the Rambler, the first was compiled by a man named James Elphinston, a Scot from Edinburgh, who began publishing while the Rambler was still going on in the same year. What is called the Edinburgh, or the second edition, in 6 octavo volumes. And in volume 1 of this edition, at the end, the volume 1 contained essays 1 through 26, were published the mottos in English. Little is known about the early relationship between Johnson and I think, there's the Edinburgh edition. And this is actually a very rare edition. There's only a few copies known in the world. So this is taken from the second issue, actually, which is much less rare. Not a whole lot is known about the relationship between the two at this early stage, but apparently Johnson, in a letter to Elphinston, gave his tacit approval to Elphinston to do this edition and to translate the mottos. Rambler 2 exemplifies the translation of the motto from Rambler 2 exemplifies an Elphinston translation that Johnson at least initially approved, but later had second thoughts about. It is virtually unrecognizable as Statius. It's more of a verse summary of the essay as a whole. Fond fleeting hope with prospect ne'er destroyed, roams ere she flies, defeated while enjoyed. Gentleman's Magazine for September 1750 printed translations for the first 30 Ramblers, and these are clearly from the Edinburgh edition, although it's not stated. The next edition, which I think should be called the third edition, but actually the great Johnson bibliographer David Fleeman denominates it the second London edition, 6 volumes in 12mo, appeared in 1752. This one also lists motto translations on a separate sheet at the end of the last volume. But here we discern a change. Johnson drops Elphinston's fumbling verses and replaces them with 2 couplets from Alexander Pope. The impatient courser pants in every vein, and pawing seems to beat the distant plain. Hills, vales, and floods appear already crossed, and ere he starts 1,000 steps are lost. And then in 1756, what's called the 4th edition was published in 4 volumes, and this one is also extremely rare. This is the last edition revised by Johnson personally, and it had served controversially for the copy text for the Yale edition of the works of Samuel Johnson. So, are there any Pope readers in the audience? Specialists? You don't notice anything unusual? Okay, you have a convenient excuse. Anybody notice anything unusual about this translation? You would have to probably be a Pope specialist to do so. It actually is from a poem that he wrote, an original poem called Windsor Forest, 1713. And this is from the manuscript, which was published in 1752. And there are the verses up close.
Well, I can't remember the name of the term, but the prosody is light, heavy, heavy triplets. Instead of having iambic pentameters, they were all light, heavy. The impatient course of pants and every day, employing seems to be distant playing. And that's to try to imitate the actions of the horse. He doesn't be very careful in his choice of prosody, and so when he uses this, somebody else, what are they, trochees? Or anapasts, I think. It's either trochee or anapasts.
Pope is famous for practicing what's called representative verse. Yeah, the sound imitates the sense. And Johnson talks about that a number of times, particularly in the life of Pope, taking issue with it, actually. So if he were here today, he may be disagreeing with you. Johnson was also, you mentioned mentoring. Johnson was a great mentor, famously generous to younger authors, and he helped John Hawkesworth launch a periodical series, The Adventurer, patterned closely upon the Rambler, which Johnson vigorously promoted, and to which he contributed some 29 essays and a number of mottos. One of the essays, number 45, he recurs to the Statius passage that we're looking at, number 45. So he does it again. He takes a Latin tag, provides a translation that's apparently not really a translation. However, there is an explanation. That's why I'm bringing it up. In 1751, 7 years after Pope's death, William Warburton, his friend and apologist, who made his career on Pope's skirt tails, edited a 9-volume edition of Pope's works, and of course Windsor Forest was included in it. And there he appends a note to line or verse 151, and I think this is on your handout too. So I'll go ahead and read this. These lines, Mr. Dryden, in his preface to his translation of Fresnoy's Art of Painting, calls wonderfully fine and says they would cost him an hour if he had had the leisure to translate them. There is so much of beauty in the original, which is the reason why I suppose Mr. P. tried his strength with them. So the Windsor Forest passage is, in fact, a translation from the lines from Statius' The Bed. According to Pope's bibliographer, Reginald Harvey Griffith, the Warburton edition appeared in June of that year. During the following year, the second London edition of the Rambler began appearing in January 1752, and the 6th volume containing the list of translations at the end that first used the Windsor Forest lines was advertised in July 1752 in the Gentleman's Magazine. So the close chronological proximity suggests that Johnson read at least this part of Pope's Warburton's edition and appropriated it for his translation. In addition to identifying the lines as an actual quotation, Warburton goes on to make an important point, I think. Dryden's offhand comment spurred Pope to do what his poetic master disdained or neglected to do. The Dryden-Pope relationship is one of a classic example of what I elsewhere have talked about as symbolic mentoring, where a writer is mentored by another writer whom they never actually meet, an older author, but whose work has a profound influence on them. So the Warburton note exhibits, from my perspective, a pregnant and representative example of the phenomenon, for it combines the energies of respect and emulation with those of agon and competition that complexly mark these sort of relationships. So on one hand, the protege is seeking to emulate the master and be like the master and honor the master, but also to outdo the master, to prove, because this is the Bloomian, Harold Bloomian theory of literary relationships. This is the original cite of the Dryden remarks, and since Warburton summarized them, we don't need to read them again. Johnson was familiar with this passage, apart from the Warburton connection. In the dictionary, he uses illustrative quotations, or what are called authorities, to illustrate definitions. And this is perhaps the most signal contribution of his dictionary. This is where the OED comes from, is this idea of illustrating a word through showing its actual use rather than trying to use merely abstract definitions. And so he quotes from it under the word fustian, or the entry for fustian in the dictionary. And incidentally, William K. Wimsatt reports that Johnson quotes 157 times from Dryden's preface in his dictionary, a total that represents roughly 38% of all of the 415 illustrations taken from the entire work, which is almost, well, it's more than a third taken from the preface rather than the work itself. And my own analysis shows that Johnson's dictionary quotations from the passage in which Dryden's citing of Statius is embedded include at least 17 entries, that is just under 11% of all the examples from the preface. So based upon this evidence, the stretch of prose surrounding the Statius lines compellingly commanded Johnson's attention. And he refers to it again later when he's writing the life of Dryden. This is also in your handout. Dryden's comparison of the first line of Virgil with the first of Statius is not happier. Virgil, he says, is soft and gentle, and would have thought Statius mad if he had heard him thundering out, quae superimposito moles geminiata colosso. Statius perhaps heats himself as he proceeds to exaggerations somewhat hyperbolical, but undoubtedly Virgil would have been too hasty if he had condemned him to straw for one sounding line. Of course, Virgil was an important symbolic mentor to Statius as well, and this indexing of their relationship here, I think, is something that fascinates Johnson and fascinates me as well. And incidentally, the first line of the Statian quotation used by Pope and Johnson is in fact a misquotation. It includes a substitution of Statius's original words with those from Georgic's 384, Stare loco nescit. So what we witness here is a case of what might be called, to borrow a Freudian term, textual overdetermination. In this tiny little literary site of the motto of Rambler 2, we find something densely saturated with a number of literary voices. And Johnson himself is implicated in this phenomenon, for he, in addition to absorbing it and assimilating it, deploys it in other of his writings elsewhere. So thank you for following along with that fairly intricate pursuit. So what do we make of that? You know, what's going on here? I'm going to go out on a limb here, on dangerous ground, and borrow a term from quantum physics called entanglement, which is the OED quotation is on your first page of your handout, one of my mottos again. And I'm not standing up here telling you I know beans about quantum physics. I think I heard that maybe 100 people on the planet really know what's going on. Maybe that's an underestimate, but I hope no one in here is one of those hundreds that will take me to task for this. But so here's what OED says. A correlation between the states of two separate quantum systems such that the behavior of the two together is different from the juxtaposition of the behaviors of each considered alone. And so I think the idea is that what takes place in one system that is entangled with another, separate across the universe, perhaps, they have a reciprocal effect upon one another. A change that happens in one shows up in the other. And that's pretty weird. But I'm using the term metaphorically here to try and put some kind of intellectual framework on how to understand these intertextual relationships amongst these various authors that we're seeing that show up in the Rambler and the dictionary. So in my idea, a quantum system is equivalent to a text. So you have two texts, and you take something from one text and move it into the other. It affects both of them reciprocally. In the case of the motto 2 Rambler 2 and Pope's Windsor Forest lines, we see a reciprocal relationship in which the reading of one influences our reading of the other and vice versa. So we see in the motto Johnson's recognition of an intertextual influence by Statius upon Pope, as well as the intricate cross-hatchings of all the other authors that we have identified. And this is not in the paper, but I should pause to say here, it's not incidental that Pope would be interested in Statius. He was very much interested in Statius and translated portions of Statius and talked about him in conversation. And I think that Statius, of course, is a Silver Age poet, coming in the footsteps of Virgil, Horace, and Ovid, and somewhat overwhelmed by that. In Johnson's account, clearly Statius doesn't come out very happy in the comparison. But, Dryden and Pope are considered Augustans, referring to the Augustans, the Golden Age. But in another sense, they are also belated. They are also coming after what Dryden called the giants before the flood, Shakespeare and Milton. And so I think Pope recognized in Statius a predicament very similar to his own, where he had these looming masters, and what do you do next? What do you do next? He wanted to write he was going to write an epic. He never did. The Dunciad was the best he could come up with. Dryden too. I think he was going to write one on King Arthur. But at any rate, looking at these little sites here, I think expands into larger insights that are, from my perspective at least, worth looking at. So another quotation from the first page of the hand, a motto, is from Derrida, Dissemination. And he says, each grafted text continues to radiate back toward the site of its removal, transforming that, too, as it affects the new territory. And again, you have this reciprocity where you have two literary sites that are mutually interpenetrating one another in a way that, the way that I understand entanglement, the concept to work. So, we are invited to consider the importance of Pope's relationships with Statius, which I just talked about, and Dryden, his great master, as symbolic mentors in both the construction of his career and the specific crafting of his verse. And likewise, we read Johnson differently as well. Rambler 2's motto reverberates not only throughout the essay, but autotextually across Johnson's oeuvre, as we've seen in the dictionary, The Adventurer, Lives of the Poets, etc. In Rambler 2, the pawing coursers connote Johnson's enthusiasm for his periodical essay series. Note it's number 2. He's just getting started. As he stands at the threshold of its inception, making, quote unquote, a new entrance into the, my next 3 quotes are all from Rambler 2, making, quote, a new entrance into the lettered world, unquote. This threshold is Janus-like, however, for it looks back to earlier writers and prepares the reader for the quotations and allusions to come in this essay. Horace is quoted twice after the motto, Epictetus and Cervantes. If, as Johnson informs us, the natural flights of the human mind are not from pleasure to pleasure, but from hope to hope, which is one of the great Johnson quotations, his practice requires that the creative endeavors of the present and the expectations of the future must be thoroughly grounded in the wisdom of the past, within the cultural heritage of ancient Greece and Rome, as well as the European Renaissance, as in Cervantes. This, I think, is the ultimate meaning of his famous remark from the last paragraph of the essay: men more frequently require to be reminded than informed. That is to say, Johnson's entire Rambler collection can be profitably read as a majestic and sweeping effort to collect, to coin Arnold, or use Arnold's phrase, the best that has been thought and written from antiquity through the early 18th century, and presented as a monumental compendium to his contemporary audience and also to posterity, to us, or those few of us who still read him. And I think these reflections that I'm offering you give us some insight into understanding better a really famous passage by T.S. Eliot, I'm sure you're all familiar with. No poet, and this is on your handout too, I think, no poet, no artist of any art has complete meaning alone. What happens when a new work of art is created is that something happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it. The existing monuments form an ideal order among themselves, which is modified by the introduction of the new, the really new work of art among them. The existing order is complete before the new work arrives. For order to persist after the supervention of novelty, the whole existing order must be, if ever so slightly, altered. And so the relations, proportions, and values of each work of art toward the whole are readjusted, and this conformity between the new and the old, and that's from the Tradition and Individual Talent. That's a very well-known quote, but it must, perhaps less well-known by the German critic Hermann Meyer. The paratextual and intertextual entanglements we are observing encourage us to read texts in this new way, not as self-contained, isolated monads, but rather as points of articulation within larger networks of interconnection and dynamic interaction. As Hermann Meyer has observed, in general, it might be maintained that the charm of the quotation emanates from a unique tension between assimilation and dissimilation. It links itself closely with its new environment, but at the same time detaches from it, thus permitting another world to radiate into the self-contained world of the novel. You know, he's talking primarily about the European novel. And Meyer's radiation is in itself entangles with Derrida's remark that the grafted text radiates back. The two comments operate reciprocally, moving from text to intertext, intertext to text, in a revolving oscillation that both exemplifies and illuminates the creation of intertextual meaning. If taken in its totality, which is impossible for the mortal mind, the entanglements radiating amongst all the text and literary history constitute a vast and vibrant universe, an intertextual totality, which such paratext as the Rambler motto and the dictionary quotation offer brief, if tantalizing, glimpses into a subspecia eternitatis universe. This is purely speculative on my part, but something I do believe in. So the next question you might ask is, was Johnson aware of this intertextual field that I'm suggesting here? And I've tried to discuss over the past 10 years or so that Johnson possessed an acutely intertextual mind and sensibility. I think it's indisputable. He does it all the time. However, he would not, I don't think, sign on to this totality that I'm postulating. He wouldn't recognize the concept quite in the same way as I do. So, in a qualified sense, yes, I think he would acknowledge that there's a real validity in terms of reading him intertextually, but not as sweepingly as I do. For example, here's a little paragraph from the preface to the dictionary, which is on your handout. I have sometimes, though rarely, yielded to the temptation of exhibiting a genealogy of sentiments by showing how one author copied the thoughts and diction of another. And in my work, I find that this adverb rarely is an understatement. Seems to me he's doing it all the time, not in every dictionary entry for sure. I mean, it is a lexicographical work, but he is interested in this, and he is doing it a lot. So let me conclude this talk by looking at two examples of genealogies from the dictionary. We'll look at two entries, dispeople, dispeopler, and whistle. And we've got the first edition of the dictionary over there. Wonderful. The Smithsonian was supposed to have it on loan, but we have it here. And well, I turned it to whistle, but somebody obviously has been flipping through the pages. So, but if you want to look at whistle and dispeople, dispeopler, they're over there. Augustan poet John Gay dedicated his poem Rural Sports to his recently acquired friend Alexander Pope in 1713. The title page in his 1720 version commemorates the friendship. This is just the title page of the works, not the poem itself. Rural Sports was originally published in January 1713 and was republished in revised form later that year. Gay read Pope's manuscript, the 1712 manuscript of Windsor Forest. He read it in manuscript, and he adopted elements, intertextually extracted elements, and used it to craft his own verse. And the dictionary shows us what he's up to. So this is dispeople, dispeopler. I won't read the words out to you. Because of grammatical necessity, one involving a verb, the other a noun, Johnson separates the two passages, and yet he manages to put them directly together on the page so that the resemblance between them becomes rather obvious. Neither Gay nor Pope's 20th century editors, in the critical editions of Gay and Pope, noted this borrowing, this comparison. So they should have read Johnson's dictionary. Gay's allusion to Pope is apt, for the latter's verses denominate tyrants who despoil the landscape in human cities. Gay's pike is analog to the ancient kings, as a passage from Walton's Complete Angler makes clear. The luce or pike is the tyrant of the freshwaters. Johnson quotes this in his dictionary under pickerel weed. But the two entries also suggest a backward extension of the genealogy. Immediately preceding the Pope quotation, in the dispeople entry, we find his heart exalts him in the harm already done, so have dispeopled heaven, Milton. That, of course, is from Paradise Lost, Book 7, describing the original and type of the tyrant, Satan. So not only did Johnson discern the connection between Pope and Gay, he provides an intertext that operates as the common source for both. It is thus evident that, used in a way that carefully examines the authorities that it exhibits, the dictionary enables us to make discoveries of influence that enhances our apprehension of the richness and intertextual density of these passages. And speaking of Milton, we'll look at one more, the whistle entry. And there we find, again, Milton and Gay aligned. While the plowman near at hand whistles o'er the furrowed land, Milton. The plowman leaves the task of day and trudging homeward whistles on the way, Gay. The similarity between Allegro and Rural Sports indicate a direct influence, apparently one that caught Johnson's eye and should also catch ours as well. The two whistling plowmen and the context of the walk on a spring-like day found in the quotation suggest that Gay takes Milton as his intertext, that both couplets are immediately followed by dairy scenes, Milton's milkmaid blithe and Gay's strokings of the damsel's hand, strongly support this identification. So the dictionary entry for whistles also suggests the importance of Milton is one of Gay's precursors. And again, I don't want to pick on these poor editors, but this is not found in the Oxford edition of Venton Dering's edition of Gay. So in conclusion, this presentation recommends that Johnson's dictionary may be understood to operate as a versatile instrument in the toolbox of literary criticism, literary scholarship, a repository of literary creativity in its own right, quite apart from its more obvious lexicographical functions. And it also urges, this talk, that paratextual elements such as quotations and mottos, allusions, and the intertextual network in which they cohere be taken more seriously as sites of literary and critical activity and power. My work suggests that Johnson deploys these connections in his writings in ways that demonstrate his intertextual mastery of the Western tradition, as well as his creative use of this tradition to offer new contributions, perhaps in a way that T.S. Eliot would recognize and approve, had he deigned to burrow with the mole-like tenacity that I pursue. But this is to, if I may be permitted my own allusion, to compare small things to great. Thank you.
We have time for questions now.
Well, I missed the source on the Pope quotation from DISPEOPLE. You have Paradise Lost for Milton, and then you have the Pope, and then you have rural sports with Gay. What was
It's from Windsor Forest.
the
So that would be an example of Gay looking at the manuscript and incorporating it, the 1712 manuscript, and incorporating it into his own poem. So is that not clear on the handout? Sorry about that.
But I mean, aside from that lexical borrowing, there's this common kind of motif of the tyrant there too, right? And, the king likened to Satan in Paradise Lost. So, I mean, Johnson didn't have any reservations about representing the king in that sort of line.
Johnson was once asked about tyranny, the tyranny of kings, and he said, well, if the kings go too far, the people will uprise and cut his head off. So Johnson has a reputation, a stereotypical reputation, although some justification in being a hidebound conservative. But, and I'm not an expert on his politics, but I think a conservative today and a conservative in the 18th century are two quite different things. And his attitudes towards politics are more refreshingly modern than are giving credit for. He didn't like George III. Of course, this was before George III. This was under George II. He didn't like George II either. And he thought that George III was ill-educated. Lord Bute, who was his tutor, Johnson thought he did a terrible job. That didn't keep Johnson from supporting the ministries under George III's regime or reign in the 1760s and 1770s, because he did write the 4 political tracts, Taxation, No Tyranny, Thoughts on the Falkland Islands, The Patriot, False Alarm, in support of the ministry. And there may have been some expectation that he do that because of the pension that he was awarded in 1762, although that was denied officially. But privately, he was a great theoretical advocate of the political stability and authority, particular after the English Civil War, which there were visible remains of the conflict, the destruction in Staffordshire, where he was born and grew up. And he would have feared that more than anything else. So political stability and the insurer of that being being a strong monarchy was important to him, but he was not. He was no approver of tyrants. I don't know if that touches upon what you were asking, but yeah, the political context is kind of curious. It is something that it gave me pause for thought when I was thinking about this presentation. But clearly, he doesn't have any qualms about doing it in his dictionary. Yes.
Yes. A couple of things. This idea of intertextuality, it also, of course, overlaps with elusiveness. It also, I was thinking how T.S. Eliot was quoted and everything else, and it reminded me of Charlotte Bronte, who expresses something very similar when she's speaking about there comes a time when an author's work is no longer his own. And she's very much talking about the reworking and the revamping. And when Jean Reeves went on to write Wax at Bouts of Sea and was taken from Bronte and was rather fearful of her kind of chutzpah in going to take from Bronte, really meditates on this idea of barring. In terms of your presentation and this idea of intertextuality too, we see not just in intertextuality with these authors of the time, but among Johnson's impetus in thinking for his own projects. In other words, it makes perfect sense that he, after kind of thinking this way and linking and working with these quotes, that he's going to extract that and create that innovativeness for the dictionary. So his work itself is intertextual, which is what you were saying.
That's a good point. That's a good way to look at the introduction of authorities into the dictionary. I hadn't quite thought of it in that respect before. But you're suggesting that his interest in genealogies of sentiment and influence may have prompted the very notion.
The very thing, this is the way I'm going to construct these words. Something about, I'm thinking of Lives of the Pope. What do you think his attitude is towards Pope? Lives of the Poets, and I'm thinking of Life of the Pope. There's this strange moment in Pope, to me it's strange, the Lives of the Poets, when Pope has that carriage accident. Johnson's describing it. And Johnson almost kind of, he's textually, there's a moment of kind of textual violence almost with the way on the page where Pope falls from his carriage. He has this carriage accident. And the way that Johnson talks about this and almost interrupts himself in the telling of Pope. Do you know what I'm speaking about? It's been a long time since I've read that. But I'm wondering, I always thought it seemed almost like, and I don't do psychoanalytic reads, but almost suppressed animosity somewhat towards Pope. I mean, Pope flies out of his cab. It's on the text. And it's in the middle of explaining Pope and Pope, he has Pope, which he has this accident. He's giving his life story, so he's not manufacturing it, but it's the framing of this. I have to look at it. It's like wishing that I had re-looked at this because I knew you were going to be talking about Pope and Johnson, but I don't.
Well, Johnson expressed a lot of animosity, non-suppressed, towards many of the people that he wrote about.
Right, very much so.
In the Lives of the Poets in particular. But Pope is a special case because, and I talk about this in a chapter in Dead Masters, I think Pope, it's either Pope or Dryden, but let's say Pope, was Johnson's greatest symbolic mentor. When Johnson came to London in 1737, he and David Garrick took turns riding a horse from Lichfield to London. Of course, Garrick became famous almost overnight, and Johnson was had very great animosity towards him because of that. But in 1737, when he came to London, Pope was God. You know, Pope was, Swift was big too, but Swift was over in Dublin. But Pope was the literary tyrant, and Johnson became that. And he became that in part by imitating Pope, and in part by competing against Pope. You know, and so Pope wrote these, you know, epistles and Horatian imitations based upon Horace. Well, Johnson did similar things, but did it with Juvenal instead, The Vanity of Human Wishes in London. And so he was kind of following in a Pope trail, but he'd swerved, and he did it differently. And you know, his descriptions of Pope at times in the life of Pope are almost, you know, we live in the age of TMZ, or these places that flash people's private lives. I mean, it's everywhere. But Johnson was one of the first people to do that. He exposed the Pope had to basically sit on telephone books to sit at the table to look tall enough to eat. You know, with every. I mean, he had very nakedly. I don't want to say brutal, but you know, it certainly took him down a few notches, and you know, you could say that's part of the dynamic of being a symbolic protege to Pope, is that, but I think those energies were stronger in the 30s and 40s than they were in the 1770s and 80s when he's writing the life. Well, he published the life of Pope in 1781, but I think the other explanation is that Johnson's adherence to the truth. You know, he wanted to not necessarily expose people, but to be truthful about them.
Well, I think...
And unflinchingly truthful. And Boswell followed in his master's footstep and took it to the next level.
Yeah, I do know the whole tenor of Life of Pope is rather, but it's interesting because of what you're suggesting with all this intertextuality, because not just that imitation being flattered, but imitation being authoritative and control over. So that's...
It's a way of
if you look at Eliot meaning too, you're going to change, you're not in control of your meaning, you're going to change every text interacting. So you can't think, once you read one text and you're familiar with the other text and reading the other text that's speaking to it, you can't think of it in the same way. That's right.
And you could say that taking these allusions and quotations and incorporating them into one's own work, you're taking their voice and using it for your own purposes.
Yeah.
And not necessarily in a way that honors the original intention, if that even is knowable or matters. Someone else?
Yeah, I'm sort of a little bit up into the way because I don't work on 18th century English poetry, but I'm interested in the whole question of literary illusion and use, reuse. And I found very fascinating what you said at the beginning, that the work of the dictionary is much longer and sort of has this feature which to me reminded of the question of common books. To which degree is actually the dictionary related to the work of him keeping a journal of quotations, and then at the same time, at a certain point, using that for compiling the dictionary, which becomes a published book, in which you described as the predecessor to the OAD, but at the same time, clearly using his whatever description you want to use, card catalog, or whether it's a codex or a different version of collection where you keep your slips with quotations, and then using it for your work. And while you just had this exchange about this modern idea of paratext and illusion, I mean, you could make the argument our training since antiquity and Middle Ages, the whole idea of keeping a journal by reading and then using what you read for your own production is basically the underpinning of our Western understanding of education. And it also works outside the Western world, but that's a different kind of worlds to go into. So I'm not quite sure whether we actually have this Jeanette rather a modern take on something that was well established. So the whole idea that I show that I have read, that I've done my homework by basically playing, by also misquoting or sort of playing around with the quotation, expecting those who are in the know to realize that I, for instance, messed around with it. I mean, what you had at the beginning of your presentation with regard to, did people realize that actually he changed Pope when we put it as a motto in there? Is it to some degree an in-joke where I clearly have literature circulating in the circle of people where everybody knows everybody and everybody reads the same books and everybody knows when I mess around with it because they get the change, and those who don't get it, they don't matter.
Yeah, it's not like that anymore. You raise a lot of good points. I think Johnson, I think there's two points to be made here about the dictionary and the Rambler. Johnson was a great advocate for keeping journals, and he kept journals throughout his life. He advised Boswell to do it, Hester Thrale. Unfortunately, shortly before he died, he created a bonfire and destroyed most of them because Sir John Hawkins took it home and copied some stuff out and brought it back, and he found out. So right before he died. So he knew that he needed to get rid of things that he didn't want to be exposed about. But he did keep something called the adversaria. I think that's a Latin term. And it's a collection of little sketches of ideas that he used for his periodical essays, for the Adventurer and the Rambler. And only a few fragments of these survive. Two of them in Boswell's life and two of them in Hawkins' life, two separate ones, so we have four. And so they show, incidentally, one of them is for Adventurer 45, and the one for Rambler 196 shows that he has the name Horace, and he used Horace for the motto. So he did use this as a kind of commonplace book in that tradition, but as far as I know, he didn't keep a commonplace book throughout his life, and it's not clear that he used this adversaria for every essay. I mean, he had an encyclopedic memory, so he could draw upon things, like Mozart composed his symphonies in his head before he wrote them down. Johnson did the same thing with Vanity of Human Wishes. But the dictionary was a different story. He actually went through and read books and underlined passages and put little notes, and then had his amanuenses scribble those down, and then they put them in the dictionary. So I think we can say fairly, with fair certainty, that the dictionary quotations were not taken from a private journal or a commonplace book, but were more from his reading, but reading directed towards the dictionary. And you raised a number of other interesting points, but I think someone else had their hand up.
When does intertextuality become plagiarism?
When did it become plagiarism?
When does it become
Well, it's interesting. That's not something that people talked about. I'm going out on dangerous ground here, generalizing about an area that's not my province. But in the Renaissance, people did. Shakespeare got most of his plots from North, or Plutarch's North, or Ovid, and nobody seemed to care. It's not until the 18th century that the idea of plagiarism becomes a sensitive one, and that's when the idea of authorial originality also starts to pop up, with Edward Young's conjectures on original composition with the 1750s. Johnson read that and he said, well, there's nothing original in that book. We already knew that already. But that's often cited as a precursor of Romantic thinking, which supposedly postulates individual genius and true literature is emanating from a divine soul communing with itself. Of course, Wordsworth was just as much of a craftsman in Coleridge as Pope and Johnson were. They did a better job of hiding it. So that's a really good question, and it would require another talk to unpack it, if not more. I know books have been published on that, plagiarism in the Romantic period in particular. Eric probably knows what they are.
Coleridge was the great victim of that kind of charge.
In Biography Literaria, yeah, because because of his overcommitment to deadlines he couldn't meet, but that's almost a tragic sort of story there. But he did it in a way that made it so obvious that he would get caught. It's like, but we're kind of straying from.
German tradition, Bloomberg has worked on it. There are one of the early essays from the 1950s is about, he traces from antiquity to the present the whole idea of that human creativity can be original. And you need the idea of human creativity being original and no longer being Neoplatonic. That actually gives you the idea of an individual mind that can generate something new, and it's not just refining something that is already there and has been prior. It's an element of prior creation, and that would be usually the break. I'm not sure about the English tradition. I know better for the German tradition, but usually it's double side, so the idea is the 1750s as a breaking point.
1750.
Yeah,
Well, Johnson wrote Rambler 143 in 1751 or 52, and it's on plagiarism. And he talks about the issue of what we're talking about here, intertextuality and plagiarism. And he comes to the conclusion that if you borrow a sentiment but appropriate it in such a way that you make it your own, then that's a creative act. It's not the highest creative act, because he looked down upon imitation very much. He thought, servile imitation was poor. He praised Milton. He would have been the greatest poet of all time, except he came after Homer. So.
I mean, it's also to some degree the realization modern. I mean, the question of whether what the moderns create is ever be equal to what the ancients have already created. I mean, that's the related discussion you have in French literature, rather, and that is also in some ways related to the idea of plagiarism. I mean, these were sort of the lines that I would see there in terms of how we get around that.
In the preface to the Fables, Dryden has a quotation about Ben Jonson that I don't remember the exact words, but it says, Ben Jonson steals so well, he's like a monarch, he steals so well he makes it his own. But if you mentioned classical literature, if you look at Virgil, where do most of his things come from but Homer? If there had been no Homer, there would be no Virgil, at least not in the form that we have.
Of course, I mean, that's the idea of the canon, and that's the idea of the topics, and the idea of training. I mean, why did the classics survive the Middle Ages? Because we had a canon everybody needed to have read in order to be educated, and then you sort of make it your own. So the question of how do you go around that is exactly the reason that we come back to having a commonplace book, because you actually need to make sure you learn from the giants on whose shoulders you sit or stand, depending on how fit you are.
A different point of view. I think there's a problem in intertextuality. I've been reading Austen the last couple of weeks, and I've been writing something as a publication on persuasion. And in persuasion, what she does is she alludes to Charlotte Smith's first and second sonnet. She never quotes it, but she alludes to it in such a way that if you knew the sonnet, you know it is. And the whole idea is that in this sonnet, Charlotte Smith is always very depressed and melancholy, and we're never going to escape the past, and there's going to be no renewal of her joy. And she says, why can we not have any renewal of joy? And we had Anne Elliot walking through the November, I can't have any renewal of joy. But then in the next paragraph, we hear about the farmer who doesn't care about poetical despondence. And he's making new paths. Now in that particular one, we see her rewriting Charlotte Smith and yet keeping her, because the novel is in general very dark, and it has a lot of darkness. And there's a Mrs. Smith in the novel who's also a cripple like Charlotte Smith. And she also can't seem to get any money because she can't go to court. So you're okay there. By which I mean, you know how far you can go and how far you can't. She says there are thousands of poetical descriptions of depression or melancholy, but she points out just the Smith one. Okay, now you go to Mansfield Park. There she actually quotes the line like you have it. She quotes a line from Isaac Brown about tobacco, and she has her character Mary Crawford quoting this line. Well, how are you going to interpret that? If you what Claudia Johnson does, in addition, is say that the line of Isaac Brown comes from Dodley's Miscellanies, and Austen did not read the poem in its original context. She only meant to refer to Isaac Brown in the Dodley Miscellanies. But if you know Isaac Brown, you who are the smart reader, realize that it's a rewrite of Pope. Now, comes Ransom Park. If you see it as a rewrite of Pope, and you think she's alluding to Pope, you come to one interpretation of Mansfield Park, which is much darker and much deeper and much broader, and it's nicer, because you can pride yourself in how deep this book is. But if you say, oh no, she just got it from Dodsley, and she just wants us to see Mary Crawford as this superficial person who's trying to, you get a very different, there's the question of how far back you go. This is an old question, because this comes from my readings of Richardson years ago. Richardson has all these quotes throughout Clarissa, and they're deep and tragic, and did they come from all these tragedies? Well, the unhappy fact is I think almost everyone comes from Bishop's Miscellany quotation. So it could have been he had Bish on his desk and was just quoting these things. Of course, everybody always says, well, he knew all the other ones, he's just using this as a memory device. Right. So there's the question of how far back, it's a kind of serious question, how far back we can peel. You mentioned this Johnson conscience, what is the understanding of it? I think Austen, in the Persuasion, knows what she's doing, that she knows she's rewriting it so clear. I think she knows she's using Isaac Brown, which is so clear. But what she means by that, and how when we are readers, we come in, we don't want to start to have, you can have everything endlessly quoting one another, and the work never stops. So there's a real problem of how far the author made you to peel the intertextuality, and how far and then how much it brings into the work. You say you bring it into the work, but what are we going to bring in? Are we going to bring in just Charlotte Smith, or are we going to bring in Byron? Because after all, Byron has a lot of morbid melancholy, and later in the book there's another character who quotes Byron. No, we don't want to, because that's not what, you see how I say this, it's a real crux of how a critic or how a reader should go about dealing with these intertextual.
Well, I think that what you're left with ultimately is the text. How do you know what the author's intention is? And so you just have to be like Detective Somerset and gather your clues together and make a strong case for, I would ask which line in Pope, and who was Pope alluding perhaps in the
Right, that's right. Well, the reason that people tend not to go back beyond the Isaac Brown, that's why I said to myself, why, this was a new edition, I forget his edition, I said to myself, why did the person not, he's always making new editions of Austen. So I said, why didn't the person quote Pope? Well, because she's quoting Claudia Johnson. Happily, I had Claudia Johnson in the house. So I go back to Claudia Johnson, and I see that she very deliberately quotes the Dodsley Miscellany. And before her, Chapman did. Now, Chapman is a big person, so when Chapman quotes and he only quoted Dodsley, so there's a real crux of how you're going to read the book, how you're going to regard it. I think intertextual is very important, but there are problems in trying to understand where it ends, where it begins. You see the same thing in films. Films are endlessly intertextual. Who borrowed from who, and how far back you're going to go.
And these notes are part of the paratext.
Well, yes, they're all in paratext, that's right. And originally, of course, you would just have the Isaac Brown quote. Originally, you would have a paragraph, but now at the bottom of the page, you have Claudia Johnson, and then you have Claudia Johnson quoting Chapman, and then you have a quote of Dodsley. And before you know it, you've left your book.
That reminds me of something that this young lady mentioned. Johnson's edition of Shakespeare, 1765, he takes notes from earlier commentators, from Hanmer, from Pope, Warburton, and he incorporates them into his notes with his own comment. And so you have this kind of heteroglossy of voices that are at the margins of his Shakespeare edition, these dialogical exchanges amongst different critics. And sometimes he'll come in and say, enough, this is it. I said, I'll tell you what it is. But more often than not, he just lets the reader sort of fend for herself or himself and try to decide who is right here. And that's another form of intertextuality in my reading of Johnson, that's not entirely dissimilar to the use of authorities in the dictionary. You know, they are there, and the reader is invited to do something with them.
Well, at some point, though, you should have to decide and say, what is it or what is it? Because in a way, you know, is there a text in the house? And you need to decide what it is that you have there. That's all. That's all I'm really saying. Another example I had recently where a new dispute, the different quartos in Hamlet, people used to say they were bad quartos, and then the actors trying to remember it. But a new reasonable idea is to try to, let's say, oh, these quartos are genuine, and we should take them seriously, and we should read them, and they're not just bad, there are other versions of Hamlet. So there comes a point where you have to say, well, no, that's not another version of Hamlet. And the person misunderstood it. So there's questions that arise once we start to take all these texts. That's another area of endeavor. Austen likes to hide her tracks. That's one of the reasons that you have a harder time with her. She doesn't want you to know all the time who she's quoting.
I understand your urge and inclination to try and arrive at some sense of stability, and eventually, you know, if you're going to write a paper or a chapter on something, you can't go into this infinite regress. I mean, you have to decide what to include and what not to include. But that infinite regress is exactly what I was suggesting is the truth of it behind you know, the realm of the text that we have. There's this universe that I imagine, postulate, and I think that's equally exciting, as well as trying to arrive at some stable notion.
Well, when I was thinking, this is Johnson who quotes Shakespeare. Well, I forget who said there's a textual corruption in Henry V, and somebody came up with the idea. It says green tables in the
False
folio.
text, yeah.
Right, it says, listen, Major Squiggly suddenly is talking about green tables. And was it Warburton or somebody? Somebody said, a babble of green fields. And that just seems so right, because the line before is a pastoral line. It just fits. So we now say, you see, so now we have a stable text.
Well, I will say, there's another question. I will say this. If you go back and look at Edmund Malone and Johnson and George Stevens and Warburton, and look at their notes and how they're arguing over commas and, you know, various things, and then you look at a modern text, say Bevington's edition, and it seems like it is stable, but it's not. It's not. That's an illusion of the print. The fixity of the print on the text makes you think, if you're an undergraduate, this is what it is. Not necessarily.
This makes me think that a perceptive student who is accused of plagiarism might use as a defense that, you know, you only have to go back, or maybe not even very far. At what point do you...
I've seen that happen. Students from Africa, I've seen them defend plagiarism by saying, well, that's how, you know, everything is sort of a common, they don't use these terms, but a common oral discourse, people circulating stories. There is no proprietary right on you know, who is said to own this or own that, and I don't know how disingenuous that is, but I've seen it in students.
Well, I think it would be hard. I think culturally there are various, I don't know if anyone's, I have had presentations when I was a graduate student. I was doing work in the Writing Center about Russia, the Soviet Union actually wanting a lack of originality and wanted this reproduction of text, and that students were inclined to do that, just the way that students from China would sometimes, they could not put their thesis or argument up front. It would take pages to get to it because it was impolite to come up, you know, and so it was different cultural. But what I was thinking with regular, you know, with another paper, and I think this is a legal I mean, with American students writing and the idea of plagiarism, a perceptive student that tried to do something would have created a work that did just what Austin did and made it his or her own. I think it's very, I don't think that that's a problem, because I think even legally, today it's the use of how you were using something to create a new work. Because there is I mean, that's just one aspect besides the moral right if you offend, but in terms of legal.
Well, just to say culturally, I mean, when I came as a graduate student to the US, I found it slightly shocking that I got as first thing at the university a code of ethics, and that's something that I thought was common sense.
Yes.
That plagiarism is illegal.
Yes.
Was needed to be mentioned at writing, and if I don't have it as an instructor in my syllabus, I cannot even apply it.
Yes.
So from that perspective, the question of, and having copyright in the American, in the legal system in the US in a way you don't have it in European societies, at least continental ones. You know, you don't have to go as far as China or Africa in order to sort of come up with different standards there.
Yeah. Well, I'm not just talking absolutely, but I'm saying actually, I was actually using that in a very example about. I think we're.
Any more questions? August?
Perhaps we could bring the whole subject of intertextuality back to Statius, with whom you began, and quote one of his most famous lines, not from the Biad, but from the Sylve. And it goes like this: Nobis neminisse relictum. What's left to us is to remember.
I couldn't help but be thinking imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, tried as that may be. Thank you very much for a very interesting, stimulating talk and discussion, and I hope you'll take some time to look at what the Rare Book folks have brought out for us here, and then if you'd like to join us for drinks and dinner, we'd be delighted to have you come along.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.